There is a chamber in the Egyptian desert that sits below ground level, half full of dark water, built from stone blocks, so heavy that modern cranes would struggle to place them, and the men who first dug it out of the sand looked at each other and said, "This doesn't belong here." That chamber is real. It's called the Osireion, and it sits directly behind one of the most famous temples in Egypt. What you're about to hear isn't a story about aliens or lost civilizations. It's stranger than that because it's a story about how archaeology actually decides what's true and what happens when the evidence and the textbook don't agree. Let's start with where we are. The site is called Abydos, near the modern town of El Araba El Madfuna in Upper Egypt. For more than 3,000 years, this was the holiest ground in the country, the spiritual home of the cult of Osiris, god of death and resurrection. Egyptians made pilgrimages here for millennia. The earliest kings of Egypt, from the very first dynasty, were buried in the desert nearby around 3000 BCE, and one of those early tombs came to be revered by later Egyptians as the actual burial place of Osiris himself. Abydos wasn't just another temple town. It was believed to be a threshold, the place where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Standing at that site today, you see the Temple of Seti I. It's a New Kingdom masterpiece, built around 1280 BCE, and there is no controversy about it whatsoever. Every wall is carved and painted. It holds the famous Abydos king list, a sequence of royal names that historians still use to reconstruct Egypt's dynastic order. It's exactly what you'd expect from a wealthy, confident empire at the height of its power, lavish, deliberate, covered in story from floor to ceiling. But walk behind that temple down a long descending passage, and you reach something completely different. This is the Osireion, and where the temple in front of it shouts, the Osireion is silent. There is no painted relief wrapping its columns, no dense hieroglyphic text crowding its walls. Instead, there are 10 massive granite piers, square and bare, holding up horizontal roof beams, architraves, that way, by most estimates, somewhere in the range of many tens of tons apiece. The whole space feels less like a temple and more like the exposed skeleton of something older, pulled up out of the ground. The structure was excavated in the early 1900s, first by a Swiss archaeologist named Edouard Neville working for the Egypt Exploration Fund, with a young researcher named Margaret Murray working alongside him under the supervision of Flinders Petrie, a man often called the father of modern archaeological method. These weren't amateurs chasing a headline. They were among the most careful excavators of their generation, and what they found didn't match what they expected from a New Kingdom building site. Start with the stone. The granite used in the Osireion isn't local to Abydos. It's red granite from Aswan, roughly 250 miles to the south, at the first cataract of the Nile. To build with it, blocks had to be cut from the quarry, moved to the river, floated or hauled downstream, dragged across the floodplain, and then lowered and fitted into a sunken chamber, with joints, according to those who examine them up close, tight enough that a blade can't be worked into the seam. There's no mortar, just stone set against stone with a precision that has impressed visitors for over a century. Then there's the water. When the Osireion's central hall was first opened, the floor was already sitting below the local water table, and it remains that way today. At the center of the hall is a raised stone platform, sometimes called the Osiris bed, rising like a small island out of the pool around it. The standard explanation is that this flooding was intentional, a deliberate architectural symbol of the primordial waters from which, in Egyptian belief, the first mound of creation emerged. It's a genuinely elegant idea, and it may well be correct. But it also sits a little uneasily next to the obsessive precision of the joinery, because work that fine is usually the kind of thing a builder wants seen and inspected in open air, not submerged for eternity. Worth noting, too, a large modern dam upstream has raised the regional water table since the mid-20th century, which means the flooding visitors see today is almost certainly more severe than what the original builders, whoever they were, ever had to contend with. Faced with all of this, Neville reached a conclusion in his 1914 publication that the textbooks would later quietly move away from. He argued the structure predated the dynastic period of Egypt, as it was then understood, that it belonged to an older architectural tradition than the pharaohs who came after it. Margaret Murray, working the same site a decade earlier under Petrie, had arrived at a similar instinct. Two trained observers, working closely with the physical evidence, both leaning toward the same uncomfortable answer. That answer didn't hold. By the 1920s and into the 1930s, a different reading took over, driven largely by the excavations of Henri Frankfurt, who dug at the site through the second half of the 1920s and published his findings in the early 1930s. Frankfurt's argument was more careful than a simple correction of Neville and Murray. He didn't claim they'd misread the stone. He agreed the Osireion looked nothing like the temple in front of it, that it was stark and archaic in style. His explanation was that this was deliberate. He proposed that Seti I built the Osireion as a symbolic cenotaph, an empty, honorary tomb, and that its builders intentionally imitated an older, heavier, more primordial architectural style to evoke the deep antiquity of the god Osiris himself. The plainness was a design choice. The flooding was a design choice. The whole structure, in this reading, was theater. A new kingdom king dressing his monument in the costume of a much older age. That theory has held the field for roughly a century now, and it's the version you'll find on the placards at the site and in most textbooks today. It's worth saying plainly, this is the mainstream, accepted archaeological position, and it's not a fringe or careless one. Frankfurt was a serious scholar, and deliberate archaism is a documented practice in Egyptian art. Later periods regularly borrowed the visual language of earlier ones on purpose, to claim continuity and legitimacy. But it's also fair to say the theory doesn't erase every question, and that's really what keeps people coming back to this site. Consider the inscriptions that anchor the whole dating to Seti I in the first place. His name does appear at the Osireion. But observers going back to Neville and Murray noted that these cartouches don't read like they were part of an integrated decorative plan from the start, the way they clearly are inside the temple just a few steps away. They sit on otherwise plain surfaces, in a way that some researchers have described as looking added rather than designed in from the beginning. That distinction matters, because a name carved into a wall tells you who wanted to be associated with the place, not necessarily who built it. Egyptian kings frequently attached their names to older sacred structures to borrow their authority. It's an established practice at other sites too. So even mainstream Egyptologists acknowledge this is a real interpretive question, not a settled one. There's also the matter of the engineering itself sitting somewhat alone in the record. The new kingdom left behind an enormous body of construction, temples, obelisks, colossal statues, and Egyptologists have a fairly detailed understanding of how New Kingdom builders typically worked: smaller stone units, generous use of mortar, ramps and sledges well documented in tomb paintings and texts. The Osireion's core hall doesn't quite look like the rest of that toolkit. That doesn't mean it's impossible for New Kingdom engineers to have built it. Egyptian engineering across all periods remains genuinely impressive and not fully documented in every technical detail, but it is part of why the structure keeps generating debate rather than settling into the background the way the temple in front of it has. It's also worth mentioning, because it's often left out, that a Greek geographer named Strabo visited Abydos in the 1st century BCE and described a structure there, likely this one, or one very near it, as already extremely old in his own time, without attributing it to Seti I specifically. That's not proof of anything on its own, but it's a reminder that people who saw this place long before modern archaeology were already treating it as ancient. So, where does that leave us? Not with a secret the establishment is hiding. Frankfurt's cenotaph theory is published, taught, and openly debated, and you can read the arguments on both sides in any decent library. What it leaves us with is something maybe more interesting than a cover-up, a genuinely unresolved question sitting quietly behind one of the most photographed temples in Egypt. A structure that may be exactly what the textbooks say, a brilliant, deliberate homage to a mythic past, built by a New Kingdom pharaoh who wanted his name bound to eternity. Or a structure that started life earlier than we currently think, later claimed and inscribed by a king who recognized its power and wanted to be associated with it. Both are live possibilities within serious scholarship, even if one of them currently has the stronger institutional backing. What isn't in dispute is the physical experience of standing there, the scale of the stone, the silence, so different from the riot of color and text just a few steps away, the water that never quite leaves. Whatever conclusion you land on, the Osireion earns its reputation honestly. Not through wild claims, but through the simple fact that when careful people looked closely at it, more than once, across more than a century, they came away unsure. And unresolved places like this are rare. Most ancient sites get explained and then get quiet. This one, somehow, never quite does. If you've been to Abydos, or if you've stood in front of a place that felt older than the story you were told about it, say so in the comments. I'd like to know where. And tell me which structure you think I should go stand inside next.